These, again, are people who work on the Strip within 2.5 miles of the Bellagio, largely people of color. Of those, the majority are Latino, and they are clearly, at least from eyeballing it, strongly in favor of Bernie Sanders.
NBC News projects Bernie Sanders is the winner in Nevada. Bernie Sanders built a turnout machine in this state, powered by young voters and Latino voters.
The happiest person right now, it's about 1:15 Moscow time. This thing is going very well for Vladimir Putin, I promise you. All the Sanders people were taking pictures wishing Jeremy Corbyn the best.
Oh, and they were mistaken. They were very mistaken, yes.
Yeah, and I don't want to go down that path.
Okay, all I've got for you, James, is Claire.
Hey.
I just love you.
Look, James, in all due respect, is a political hack. We are taking on the establishment. This is no secret to anybody. We're taking on the wall. I guess the former head of Goldman Sachs attacked me yesterday.
Yeah, he had
We're
some
taking on Wall
well.
Street. He did, yeah, Wall Street. And the insurance companies don't like me. And you know what? The pharmaceutical industry, which is charging us 10 times more for the same drugs they sell in Canada, they don't like me either. Nor does the fossil fuel industry, because their product happens to be destroying our planet. Nor does the military-industrial complex or the prison-industrial complex. We are taking on Trump, the Republican establishment, Carville, and the Democratic establishment. But at the end of the day, the grassroots movement that we are putting together of young people, of working people of color, want real change.
Was this an economy election? And if so, is Sanders right that on populist, working class, kitchen table issues, the Dems didn't do enough?
I think Senator Sanders has some of a point here. And that is, there were things we could have run on harder that have effect.
As you saw, one of Bernie Sanders' biggest naysayers was forced to admit that he was absolutely right, even though it seemed like it literally caused him physical pain to do so. But James Carville is not alone, because Democratic Senator Chris Murphy also recently conceded that Bernie Sanders' populist policies was the Democratic Party's ticket to victory. But here's my favorite. So in February of 2020, David Brooks wrote an article for the New York Times titled, "No, not Sanders, not ever." But in the aftermath of Trump's victory in 2024, he changed his tune, writing, "Maybe Bernie Sanders was right." Yeah, everyone's admitting that Bernie Sanders was right now that it's too late. Trump's inauguration is just days away, but we'd now be in an entirely different timeline if everyone just listened to Bernie Sanders in the first place. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because Nolan Higdon wrote an article published in Salon this week titled "Why the Legacy Media Suddenly Sound a Lot Like Bernie Sanders," and adds, "Bernie Sanders was right." And in response to the virality of that article, Bernie Sanders responded, writing on Twitter, "Yes, we were right then. We are also right now. The focus has got to be on bringing the working class of this country together to defeat oligarchy." Notice how he didn't say I was right. He said we were right. But if anybody deserves to do a victory lap, it's that man. But reading this article actually made me emotional, because Nolan revisits the 2016 and 2020 Democratic Party primaries and explains in painstaking detail how the Democratic Party establishment tried to undermine Bernie Sanders' movement at every step of the way, and in doing so, put us on this dark path that we're on right now. And them knowing that they're wrong obviously isn't going to change things now, nor will it get them to rethink their strategy going forward. But it's important to talk about this so regular people understand how our leaders deprived us of a better future that we could have had. So let's go back to 2016 and 2020, specifically the Democratic Party primaries, where the party establishment responded to the rise of Bernie Sanders' movement by doing everything in their power to crush that movement. Nolan writes, in 2016, the Democratic National Committee actively suppressed Sanders' campaign, something they have since admitted by giving Hillary Clinton advance notice of debate questions, fabricating stories about Sanders supporters throwing chairs, and counting delegates' votes before they had been cast to make Hillary Clinton's lead over Sanders appear larger than it was. The legacy media amplified these tactics by claiming Clinton was more electable than Sanders, despite evidence to the contrary, and incorrectly asserting that his supporters were all white men with the pejorative label Bernie Bros. Similarly, Similarly, studies documented the Bernie blackout, where Sanders received 23 times less coverage than Donald Trump and significantly less than Clinton during the 2015-2016 campaign. In 2020, the media onslaught continued, with Sanders receiving the most negative coverage of any candidate, accused of being unelectable despite evidence to the contrary, having his polling misrepresented or completely invisibilized in legacy media reporting, being smeared as a Russian stooge despite flimsy evidence, style of politics compared to communist executions by MSNBC's Chris Matthews, and receiving attacks based on unsupported claims, such as CNN siding with Democratic primary rival Elizabeth Warren in a he said, she said debate with Sanders. Now, with regard to that kerfuffle between him and Elizabeth Warren back in 2020, obviously none of us know what was said behind closed doors between the two of them, but Elizabeth Warren basically accused Bernie Sanders of saying that he didn't believe a woman could win. But we all know that that is not true, because back in 2015, Bernie Sanders only ran for president because Elizabeth Warren refused to do so. He was trying to encourage her, as was the grassroots, to challenge Hillary Clinton, but she did not want to challenge Clinton, so Sanders stepped in. So why would Bernie Sanders say something like that if he encouraged a woman to run in the first place? Nonetheless, the legacy media and Democratic Party elites use that as an opportunity to insinuate that Bernie Sanders was sexist. Now, Nolan doesn't point this out in the article, but in 2020, Democratic elites also talked openly about the prospect of literally stealing the nomination away from Bernie Sanders by changing the rules and pushing for a brokered convention if he only had a plurality of delegates. As this political headline put it, DNC members discussed rules change to stop Sanders at the convention. In other words, if he won, he could have still lost. And in retrospect, a lot of people now see that each time they undermined Bernie Sanders' campaigns in 2016 and 2020, they put another nail in their coffin each time and ultimately paved the way for Trump's victories by needlessly antagonizing their own base, which no party should ever do, but the Democratic Party did that multiple times. But the answer is, why? Why snuff out this organic grassroots movement that's emerging in your own party? Don't you want that to happen? I mean, that will make you more popular. And Nolan explains in the article that it all comes down to corruption as well as fundamental differences between electoral strategies. So Bernie Sanders saw the rise of fascism, arguably even before Donald Trump, and realized that people were susceptible to right-wing radicalization because their material conditions continued to deteriorate year after year after year. So the question is, how do you address that? Well, you address it by improving material conditions, obviously. You give people free healthcare, free education, you give them higher wages and create more economic opportunities for them. The antidote to fascism is left-wing populism, where you form a multiracial, multi-generational coalition of working class people. And that right there is crucial, because if you bring all working class people together, you inhibit the right's ability to divide and conquer with their divisive white identity politics bullshit, right? Now, on the contrary, the Democratic Party subscribed to an idea called demographic destiny, meaning that their victories would eventually be automatic due to changing demographics. And it makes sense on paper, since people of color and marginalized groups, they were growing in number, and they disproportionately supported the Democratic Party, naturally, seeing that the Republican Party was so fucking racist and bigoted. Now, the Democratic Party's prominence, in theory, would continue to increase as these demographics continue to grow. And I remember back in 2010, after Republicans won back the House and we were all sad, Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC smugly explained how Republicans may have won the battle, but they've lost the war because Texas, for example, is on the cusp of becoming blue because of the growing Hispanic population. And once that happens, it's over for Republicans. And I remember eating that shit up at the time thinking, man, he's right. Republican rule isn't long for this world. And I tried to find the clip of this. I couldn't find it. I watched it live on TV. So, it's out there in the ether. But, he assured us that demographic destiny was true. But there's a couple of problems with that theory in retrospect. First and foremost, it assumes that marginalized groups would remain loyal to the Democratic Party in perpetuity. Second, it meant that Democrats felt like they didn't really have to have an economic message and that their base would be satisfied with aesthetic progress. A black president, a woman president, a gay ambassador, or whatnot. And while this type of descriptive representation does matter, it's not an adequate substitute for economic politics. These advances aren't going to materially improve conditions for women and people of color and queer people. And the third problem with this theory is that Democrats ignored economic issues entirely that affect all of these groups. And worse, they pursued neoliberal policies that exacerbated the problems that these groups were already facing, and they argued against meaningful reforms by dividing people by identity. For example, Nolan writes, during both of those election cycles, the legacy media largely maintained that Sanders' appeal to the working class would alienate key constituencies, particularly people of color, women, the LGBTQIA community, for the Democratic Party because it was racist and sexist. This was summarized with Hillary Clinton's retort to Sanders' proposal to trust bust the big banks. Quote, if we broke up the big banks tomorrow, would that end racism? Would that end sexism? Would that end discrimination against the LGBT community? Would that make people feel more welcoming to immigrants overnight? In response, the crowd chanted no. And that right there was a real problem because the Democratic Party tried to disaggregate class politics with racial politics and social justice politics, while not realizing that working class people includes Black women, Latino people, queer people. So by making this an either or, you're dichotomizing it when it needs to be both. So as you can see, the goal was to cynically frame Sanders as a class reductionist. And to be fair, your analysis absolutely must contain both class-based and social justice politics. Delivering materially for all working class people indeed is crucial, but that isn't going to eliminate racism or liberate queer people, for example. You do have to do both. And Bernie Sanders, he did struggle in some ways to talk about race politics. He came from an overwhelmingly white state, and as a result, he did struggle to communicate his understanding on issues related to race and gender, particularly in 2016. And, he didn't have a Black agenda, and I think that hurt him, right? But by 2020, even though he still was by no means perfect, he made a huge improvement. He more meaningfully engaged in issues regarding sex and gender, and he even supported free gender confirmation surgeries as part of Medicare for All. Now, imagine if a politician did that today. Republicans would call them woke and accuse them of wanting to do these surgeries on children. But do you want to know what people said about that policy proposal back in 2020? Jack fucking shit, because they were all too busy trying to undermine Bernie Sanders' broader message about class. And that kind of just demonstrates how powerful it is to combine class politics with social justice politics. The antagonistic scapegoating that Republicans rely on to win elections just wasn't viable with Bernie Sanders because he was cutting to the core and addressing real issues that affect working class people. So voters weren't as easily distracted with stories about trans athletes or immigrants or crime because Bernie Sanders had a concrete plan to change their lives for the better. It was harder for Republicans to frame Bernie's politics as us versus them. It's not, wow, well, why do these marginalized groups get special treatments while I'm still struggling? It was a message of we all can benefit. We all can have better lives. And that was really, really powerful. But the Democratic elites rejected Bernie's politics because, let's face it was antithetical to their neoliberal worldview and conflicted with the interests of their donors. Every single policy that Bernie Sanders proposed went against what the Democratic Party's corporate donors wanted. And the Democratic Party had to make a choice. Do we roll with this populist style of politics, or do we stick with the status quo and cross our fingers and hope that demographic destiny comes to fruition and just side with the donors? And they opted for the latter. And that's not to say that Democrats haven't made some positive changes in light of Bernie Sanders' rise. Even though Biden is a war criminal, his NLRB enabled workers to make substantial gains. And I think that Kamala's child tax credit and Medicare expansion, these were really good proposals. So there has been movement, some movement, albeit incremental movement. Incremental policies that all paled in comparison to Bernie Sanders' proposals that were systemic. And it was questionable if Kamala would ever talk about these policies again because, Joe Biden responded to the popularity of Medicare for All by proposing a public option. And then once he was elected, we never heard about it again. He ran on $2,000 checks. Once they were elected, that number got cut down to, like $1,400, $1,600? So there's a trust issue here. But regardless, even though they tried to adapt at least a little bit, it wasn't enough, and Trump still won. And Higdon continues, Sanders and his supporters were not blindsided by the election, referring to Kamala's defeat in November, and used the election as an opportunity to remind audiences that his assessment over the last decade was correct. In a widely circulated post-election op-ed for Boston Globe titled Democrats Must Choose, the Elites or the Working Class, Sanders reiterated this point that the Democratic Party had failed to attract or energize the working class and lost the election as a result. Given the overwhelming evidence that the Democratic Party not only lost, but was losing key parts of its base, young people, women, Muslims, and people of color, legacy media figures such as Carville had no choice but to tacitly admit that their political theory was wrong. But don't fool yourself. Them admitting that they're wrong doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to change. Even if they did embrace Bernie Sanders' style of politics, it may be too late. Because I genuinely don't know if the next election will be free or fair now after 4 more years of Donald Trump. But I don't think we even have to speculate about whether or not the party is going to change, because they could have already demonstrated their willingness to change by passing the baton to an actual left-wing populist like Bernie Sanders, named Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They could have made her the top-ranking Democrat on the House Oversight Committee, but instead they opted to give that job to a 74-year-old corporate Democrat with esophageal cancer, which is a decision that is truly baffling. That man should be resting and focusing on his health. He is in no position to be the face of the Democratic Party's opposition to Donald Trump, but here we are. So clearly Democrats didn't learn their lesson, and I see a lot of people focused on the upcoming DNC race, which is important, but I focused on that last time, and the Democratic Party had an opportunity then to opt for somebody more progressive in Keith Ellison, and Obama stepped in at the last moment to make sure that Tom Perez was the winner. So I have no interest in even following that, because I have no hope that the party is going to change. And their stubbornness is in part why we're in this predicament today, where a fascist with authoritarian tendencies and colonialist ambitions is about to take office and fuck up the country for generations. And it's so sad because it didn't have to be this way. In fact, Mexico is giving us a glimpse at what could have been. As David Adler writes, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum proclaimed at her 100-day address, quote, "We will not return to the neoliberal model. We will not return to the regime of privileges and corruption. We say for the good of all, first the poor." And guess what? People love her. She has an 80% approval rating and won in a landslide. Her predecessor, President AMLO, made the same promises that she made, but unlike Democrats, he actually delivered. And she seems poised to do the same thing. And the result has been that fascism in Mexico has been thoroughly defeated. In fact, the right wing in general is basically politically irrelevant in Mexico due to the popularity of Sheinbaum and AMLO's party. And even though I'm really happy for them, I've got to admit, I'm a little bit jealous, because we could have had that. That could have been us. We could have had it all. They elected their first female president and improved people's lives. That is how it's done. And Mexico, they're not a fluke. The last time that we actually did have a strong left-wing president in this country, he was elected so many times that we had to create term limits, because he just kept winning again and again and again. Because guess what? When you actually pass policies that improve people's lives and things get better, they will vote for you. But I'll be honest, it kind of feels pointless to even talk about strategy now, because what's the point, right? I'm glad that they're all admitting that Bernie Sanders is right. I guess that's cathartic in some sense. But I don't know if we can change things at this point. I genuinely don't know if America will be the same after 4 more years of Donald Trump. I don't know if democracy, or what's left of it, can survive another Trump term. I genuinely don't know. I don't know if the planet can survive, even if democracy can survive. So, the point is that times are really fucking bleak right now, and we could be in an entirely different timeline where Bernie Sanders just completed his 2nd term and his successor was about to be sworn in. But instead, we're stuck in the worst timeline imaginable, where Donald Trump is about to be sworn in again, this time after inciting an insurrection and evading prison time. So, shit's dark. But as things continue to get worse, harness the rage that you're feeling and use it to overthrow the very elites that are responsible for this shitty predicament. And in the event we ever do get the chance to vote for somebody who's a real left-wing populist like Bernie Sanders, and they're not full of shit, please don't let corporate media trick you into voting against your own self-interest.
The Humanist Report is fake news. Mike only cares about Crazy Bernie and his wacky socialist ideas. Sad, very sad. I'm unsubscribing.